Well, the topic of exploring the relationship between NI dominance and mental illness, of course, is it's a tricky one, it's a thorny one, and I feel the obligation to begin with a disclaimer and to say, I'm not a therapist, and I'm only observing, or rather sharing observations, reflections, thoughts I've had on this topic. Because I think that there is an interesting link to try to trace here. It seems to me that, of course, issues with mental health, mental illness in general, is not by any stretch of the imagination. It's not the province of, the exclusive province of NI dominance. It's not even the favored domain, if I may put it like this, of NI dominance. Something that can strike just about anyone, any place. There's no priority here, right, regarding NI dominance. And yet, I think that there is something peculiar about the relationship that NI dominants have with mental illness, depression, and other things. If you like, alienation, if we accept that existential alienation, which is a mode of being, right? So far, we're not talking about mental illness. And if you want to know more about this mode of being and how INFJs exist in this mode of alienation from external reality, regardless of what level of health they have, of their background, of their country, alienation is the basic thing to understand. The Ecstatic Soul, my book from a few years ago, still available down below, explores this in detail and many other things. So you can get this book if you want to know more about this. Alienation is part of what I like to call the existential constitution of the INFJ. And you could consider the existential constitution of an INFJ to be the emergent manifestation of their cognitive function stack. So we have the cognitive function stack, which is NIFE, TISE. Among its emergence manifestations is the existential constitution, which involves, among other things, alienation. There's, of course, you might be familiar with these concepts by now: haziness, prescience, disembodiment, and these other modes. I still stand by them since, I wrote the book. But consider for a moment that alienation, which is also something that the INTJ experience, although I always make the point that it's harder for INFJs to retrieve the world than INTJs due to their having FE and not SE. But if you think about it, when you have actual mental illness, this typically involves a form of mental alienation. So it's tempting, and seems to me to make sense, to trace a connection of some kind. Maybe the details of the connection are a bit more difficult to unpack. There's a sequence from existential alienation to mental alienation. Like I said before, mental health problems are not the province of NI dominance, but I think that because there is necessarily a kind of acquaintance, a kind of family resemblance between mental alienation and existential alienation. Mental alienation is something that is going to somehow, somewhere, often seem familiar to NI dominance. And what I mean by this is that mental alienation, one of the effects of being mentally ill, is not necessarily going to be taken by an NI dominant as a symptom of something to be really attended to, worked on, treated through therapy and other things possibly, but let's say therapy, really just paid attention to, something not to be ignored. So some NI dominants, including I'm thinking particularly the population of what I call the solipsistic INFJs, the INFJs who tend to be highly introverted and rely very much on their NI function more than other functions, and tend to be very self-contained in their life and not have a lot of friends and be quite solitary and happy this way. I explore them in The Infinite Soul, which is my new book. So if you want to hear more about that, get this book. The links are below, and everything to do with leading a purposeful, rich, and meaningful life as an INFJ in the world. This is more about the INFJ psyche. This is more about INFJs in the world. So you can get this too. The solipsistic INFJ is going to be particularly prey to this. They're going to often not just assume that mental alienation is kind of the natural progression of where their NI is going, because it seems familiar and it's concrete and it has a certain darkness to it. But these INFJs can often be dark enough, and they might just think that they have progressed. They have carried the logic of their NI worldview to such a point of consistency, because for them that the whole idea is to be consistent to their vision and to their worldview, that inevitably must lead to some mental alienation and isolation. So they not only would they tend to see this thing as unsurprising or normal, but sometimes they can even see it as positive. And that's where clearly there's a danger there, because they might actually double down and persist in their alienation. I'm here talking about the mental alienation, and therefore take a sort of solace in their depression or other forms of illness. And you see that I've encountered INFJs like this. This is why I'm sharing this report, if you like, is that I've encountered INFJs like this. Not many in the real world, partly because you just don't meet them, but online, INFJs come out with really weird things they said, super solipsistic, super out there, completely self-contained, very hard to touch them, penetrate them. But them clearly thinking that they're on the right path and everybody else is either wrong or just irrelevant. So there is a kind of reinforcement of symptoms that are actually symptoms of mental health problems. The self-contained worldview that NI guides us towards, and which starts from a place of alienation from external reality. Again, in itself, it's not correlated more than other functions, I think, to mental health issues, mental illness. But it can, in some ways, almost provide a justification for why that either that is normal or even that is good. I mean, if I had to use an example, consider Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche, there's a debate between INFJ and INTJ. Most people think INTJ, I think INFJ, regardless. Nietzsche became ill. If you read his writings, he's euphoric, which happens in those cases. But he seems to be just at the peak of his writing at the same time that he is, nearing collapse. And when he collapsed, then it was over for him, at least as far as writing went. But you get this sense of exhilaration and power, and I think that the fact that Nietzsche was almost certainly an NI dominant explains part of it. So there's a complicated relationship here between NI and mental illness. I think there's a risk of a relationship of reinforcement, because the self-contained worldview that NI tends to promote and tends to indicate as a good thing can be mixed up sometimes with things that are in fact bad for you, or at least signs that you're not well and you ought to get help for. So try to keep this in mind. It's important to, if you're an NI dominant, to distinguish the right from wrong and true from false. Okay, guys, I have a Patreon page. Support me, please, if you can. Down there below, so helpful to keep me afloat. I will see you very soon. Bye-bye.